Hello everyone, and welcome back to a brand new video. Buckle up, because today we're diving headfirst into a number so astronomically large it makes even Bezos's net worth look like spare change. We're talking about the staggering $64.82 trillion. Yes, you heard that right. Extracted from India by the UK during colonialism. This isn't about some forgotten historical footnote. This is about the systematic dismantling of one of the world's richest economies, leaving behind a legacy that continues to cast a long shadow. Over the next 20 points, we'll be unpacking the findings of a groundbreaking Oxfam study that lays bare the sheer scale of this massive wealth transfer. Get ready, because some of this is going to be, well, let's just say you might want to make yourself a cup of tea. You're going to need it. Welcome to our deep dive into the staggering $64.82 trillion extracted by the UK from India during colonialism. Now, you might be thinking $64.82 trillion. That's a lot. How did they even... Well, friends, let's just say the British were nothing if not creative. They implemented this ingenious little system where they basically forced India to pay for its own occupation. Think of it like being forced to pay rent to someone who broke into your house, ate all your food, and then claimed they were doing you a favor. They slapped heavy taxes on everything from salt to textiles, crippling local industries and forcing Indians to buy overpriced British goods. It's like being charged an arm and a leg for a cup of sugar, except the sugar was yours to begin with. And the arm and leg you paid with, yeah, those get chopped off and shipped back to Britain as profit. This wasn't just about making a quick buck. It was about deliberately undercutting India's ability to compete, turning a once thriving economy into a captive market for British goods. It's the economic equivalent of punching someone in the gut, stealing their lunch money, and then forcing them to buy a soggy sandwich from you at an exorbitant price. Speaking of things that were stolen, let's talk about India's resources, shall we? I'm talking about everything from the spices that made British food even remotely palatable, to the cotton that clothed them, to the precious minerals that fueled their industrial revolution. India was basically a walking, talking treasure chest, and the British, well, they weren't shy about helping themselves to its contents. They shipped out raw materials by the boatload, leaving India's own industries starved of resources. Imagine having a garden overflowing with delicious fruits and vegetables, only to have someone come in, pick it clean, and then sell you back a can of lukewarm beans. This wasn't just about resource extraction, it was about control. By keeping India dependent on British manufactured goods, they ensured that the wealth generated from those resources flowed right back into their coffers. Genius, right? Well, evil genius, but still. But hey, at least nobody was forced to work for free, right? Oh wait, remember all those resources we talked about? Well, someone had to get them out of the ground and into those British ships. Enter forced labor. Millions of Indians were coerced into working on plantations, in mines, and on infrastructure projects, often under horrific conditions. This wasn't just about cheap labor, it was about dehumanization, treating human beings as disposable cogs in their imperial machine. It's estimated that millions died from overwork, disease, and outright brutality, all so that Brits could enjoy their sugar with a side of conveniently ignored guilt. This chapter isn't just about numbers, it's about the countless individual lives destroyed in the name of profit. It's a stark reminder that the true cost of colonialism can never be measured in pounds or rupees, but in the immeasurable suffering inflicted upon generations of Indians. Now let's talk about land ownership, because apparently stealing resources and labor wasn't quite enough. The British implemented a land revenue system so convoluted and ruthless it would make your head spin. They introduced the zamindari system, which essentially appointed local landlords to collect taxes on their behalf. These zamindars, incentivized to squeeze as much as possible from the peasantry, often resorted to extortionate tactics, pushing farmers into debt traps they could never escape. Imagine being forced to pay rent on your own ancestral land to a landlord who works for people who stole that land in the first place. This wasn't just about revenue, it was about control. By creating a system where farmers were perpetually indebted, they ensured a steady supply of cheap labor. It's the age-old story of colonialism, take the land, exploit the people, and call it progress. But hey, at least India still had its famed textile industry, right? Well, about that. Remember those overpriced British goods we talked about? To ensure their popularity, the British systematically dismantled India's once thriving textile industry. They imposed crippling tariffs on Indian textiles, making them uncompetitive in the global market. They even went so far as to physically destroy Indian looms and impose taxes on weavers. It's like deliberately breaking your competitor's sewing machine, then forcing them to buy clothes from you at inflated prices. This wasn't just about economic competition. It was about crushing India's spirit of self-reliance. By turning a once proud manufacturing hub into a supplier of raw materials, they cemented their own dominance in the global market. Here's a fun fact. Did you know that the British Empire was essentially built on the backs of Indian taxpayers? I'm not exaggerating. The taxes levied on Indians weren't just high, they were extortionate. These taxes funded everything from the lavish lifestyles of British officials to, and this is the real kicker, the British military presence in India itself. That's right, Indians were forced to pay for their own oppression. Imagine being forced to pay for the chains that bind you. This wasn't just about raising revenue, it was about perpetuating British power. By bleeding the Indian economy dry, they ensured that any resistance to their rule would be met with overwhelming financial and military might. Now let's talk about trade, shall we? Because what's colonialism without a healthy dose of unfair trade practices? The British East India Company, granted a royal charter, essentially held a monopoly over trade with India. They dictated the terms, set the prices, and reaped the profits. Indian merchants sidelined, Indian businesses crushed under the weight of unfair competition. It's like being forced to play a game where your opponent gets to make up the rules, cheat outrageously, and then pocket all the winnings. This wasn't just about profit, it was about control. By controlling the flow of goods in and out of India, they could manipulate markets, cripple local industries, and ensure that the wealth generated from trade flowed directly back to Britain. But wait, there's more. As if unfair trade practices and crippling taxes weren't enough, the British also decided to play fast and loose with the currency. They manipulated the exchange rate between the British pound and the Indian rupee to their advantage, making Indian goods artificially expensive abroad and British goods artificially cheap in India. It's like going to a currency exchange where the teller deliberately gives you a terrible exchange rate because they know you have no other choice. This further tilted the playing field in their favor, allowing them to buy Indian goods at a steal and flood the market with British products. This wasn't just about financial maneuvering, it was about economic warfare. By devaluing the Indian rupee, they deliberately undermined India's economic sovereignty and ensured their own financial dominance. Let's play a game. I call it Guess the Raw Material. I'll give you a hint. It's probably something you're wearing, eating, or using right now. Cotton? Yep. Sugar? You got it. Tea? Bingo! India was a treasure trove of raw materials, and the British were all too happy to exploit them. They shipped these materials back to Britain, where they were processed and sold at exorbitant prices. It's like taking a bite of a delicious cake only to realize you're only allowed to eat the frosting, while someone else devours the rest and charges you for the privilege. This wasn't just about resource extraction, it was about deliberately keeping India trapped in a cycle of economic dependence. By preventing India from developing its own industries, they ensured a steady supply of cheap raw materials and a captive market for their finished goods. Now let's talk about something truly horrifying: the famines that ravaged India under British rule. These weren't just natural disasters, they were man-made catastrophes, exacerbated by British policies that prioritized profit over human life. The British forced farmers to grow cash crops like cotton and indigo instead of food crops, leaving millions vulnerable to starvation. They then turned a blind eye as millions perished, even exporting grain while Indians starved. It's like watching your neighbor's house burn down while you casually roast marshmallows over the flames. This wasn't just about negligence, it was about a callous disregard for human life. These famines weren't just tragedies, they were crimes against humanity, with the blood of millions staining the hands of the British Empire. You know what they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Or in this case, the road to extracting India's wealth was paved with thousands of miles of railways. Now, I know what you're thinking. Railways are good, right? Well, yes and no. While the British did expand India's railway network, they did so primarily to facilitate the transportation of resources out of India and British goods into India. It's like building a giant conveyor belt designed to efficiently move all the valuables out of your house and into someone else's. This wasn't just about infrastructure development. It was about building a system that facilitated their economic exploitation. Every mile of track laid down was another nail in the coffin of India's economic independence. Remember that whole thing about Indians paying for their own oppression? Well, it gets worse. Not only were Indians subjected to exorbitant taxes, but a significant portion of those taxes went towards funding the very military force that occupied them. That's right, Indians were forced to pay for the guns, the ammunition, and the salaries of the soldiers who enforced their subjugation. It's like being forced to pay for the whip that's about to lash you. This wasn't just about financial burden, it was about adding insult to injury. It was a constant reminder that their hard-earned money was being used to perpetuate their own subjugation. Now let's talk about debt. Because what's colonialism without a healthy dose of predatory lending? The British were masters of using debt as a tool of control, saddling India with massive loans that took generations to repay. These loans, often given on unfavourable terms, were used to finance everything from infrastructure projects that benefited British interests to wars fought to expand the British Empire. It's like lending someone money to buy a car, then repossessing their house when they can't make the payments. This wasn't just about financial gain, it was about creating a system of economic dependence that kept India tethered to Britain long after they'd left. Now, let's talk about education, because what's a good colonial power without ensuring that the colonized are properly educated? The British implemented an education system in India, but it wasn't designed to empower Indians. It was designed to create a class of Indians who would serve British interests. They emphasized English language instruction and Western values, while neglecting traditional Indian knowledge systems. It's like teaching someone how to cook a perfect English breakfast while systematically erasing their knowledge of their own culinary heritage. This wasn't just about cultural imperialism, it was about creating a workforce that was both subservient and dependent. You know what they say, the law is the same for everyone. Unless, of course, you're talking about British colonial law in India. The British implemented a legal system that, while claiming to be impartial, was designed to maintain their dominance. They introduced laws that favoured British businesses, restricted Indian rights, and criminalised dissent. It's like playing a board game where your opponent gets to write the rules, interpret them as they see fit, and then penalise you for breaking rules you didn't even know existed. This wasn't just about maintaining order, it was about legalising their exploitation. Now, let's talk about something a little more nuanced, the cultural exploitation of India. The British, fascinated by India's rich cultural heritage, couldn't help but, well, appropriate it. They took artifacts, they copied designs, they even tried to claim credit for some of India's most iconic cultural treasures. It's like going to a friend's house, admiring their taste in furniture, and then taking it upon yourself to mass-produce cheap knockoffs and sell them for a profit. This wasn't just about cultural appreciation, it was about commodifying and profiting from another culture's heritage. Now, let's talk about something truly insidious, the way the British exploited existing social hierarchies in India to maintain their control. They understood the power dynamics at play and deliberately exacerbated them, pitting different groups against each other to prevent a united front against colonial rule. It's like deliberately starting a fight between your siblings so that you can swoop in and take control of the TV remote. This wasn't just about political maneuvering, it was about deliberately sowing discord and division within Indian society to maintain their grip on power. Let's be blunt. The British didn't just extract wealth from India. They shipped it out by the boatload. Gold, silver, precious stones, you name it. If it was valuable, it was on its way to lining the pockets of British elites and funding the British economy. It's like siphoning off all the water from a lake, leaving behind a dry and barren wasteland. This wasn't just about enriching themselves, it was about deliberately impoverishing India. Now, let's not forget about the countless Indians who dared to resist British rule. The British, never ones to tolerate dissent, responded to these uprisings with brutal force, crushing any opposition with ruthless efficiency. But here's the thing. Suppressing these uprisings wasn't just about maintaining control, it was also about sending a message that said, resistance is futile and expensive. Every rebellion, every protest, every act of defiance was met with a wave of violence and financial retribution that further crippled the Indian economy. Here's a fun fact. Not all Brits benefited equally from the exploitation of India. In fact, much of the wealth flowed directly into the pockets of a select few, the British elite. We're talking about the top 10% who sipped their tea and ate their biscuits while millions of Indians starved. They were the shareholders in the East India Company, the owners of the factories that processed Indian raw materials, the landlords who collected exorbitant rents. This wasn't just about economic disparity, it was about a system rigged to benefit a select few at the expense of millions. So, there you have it. 20 shocking facts that reveal the true cost of British colonialism in India. These aren't just historical footnotes, they are stark reminders of the devastating legacy of exploitation that continues to cast a long shadow over India today. Understanding this history isn't about dwelling on the past, it's about acknowledging the long-lasting impacts of colonialism and working towards a more just and equitable future. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more insightful content.
Yeah.